Welcome to another episode of Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. And we're going to get to have a little bit of all of that today. I get to interview someone who I've talked to a couple of times and met a couple of months ago for the first time, at a meeting. Andrew Leland is the author of The Country of the Blind, and he will tell us about that. And we will have lots of fun things to talk about, I am sure. He's been a podcaster. He's an author, needless to say. He's written things. And I don't know what else. We'll see what other kinds of secrets we can uncover. Fair warning, right? So, Andrew, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I really appreciate you coming. Why don't you start by telling us a little about kind of the early Andrew, growing up and some of that kind of stuff?
Oh, sure.
A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Right. Planet called Los Angeles. I was born in LA. Yeah. And my parents moved to New York pretty quickly, and they split when I was 2. So for most of my childhood, I was kind of bouncing in between. I lived with my mom, but then I would go visit my dad on holidays, and my mom moved around a lot. So we were in New York, just outside the city, and then we moved to Toronto for 2 years, and then back to New York, and then to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and then to California, Southern California. So I lived a lot of places, and that was all before college. Yeah, what can I tell you about young Andrew? I always was interested in writing and reading, and I come from a family of writers. My mom is a screenwriter. My grandfather is a playwright. My aunt is a novelist. And my dad, I remember when I was a kid, he had a column for Videography magazine and has always been super interested in digital technology, from the earliest days of desktop publishing. And he worked for like early days of USA Network. So like this kind of shared interest that I inherited from my parents of, creativity and media, I guess was one way you could put it, storytelling and sort of like playing around with electronic media. And, I grew up, I was born in 1980. So by the time I was an adolescent, the internet was just starting to reach its tendrils into our lives. And I remember my dad bought me a modem, and when I was like, I don't know, 14 or something. And I was definitely one of the first kids in my class to have a modem and messing around on message boards and stuff. So that was very influential for me. And it was around that time that I started to notice that I had night blindness, and I kind of diagnosed myself with retinitis pigmentosa on that early web, before the days of WebMD or anything like that. But it just, there didn't seem to be a lot of causes for adolescent night blindness. And so I kind of figured it out and then sort of just compartmentalized it, like kicked that information to the side somewhere, dusty corner of my brain, and just went about my life. And then it wasn't until later in my teenage years, I'd already done a year in college, I think in Ohio, where I said, you know what, this is getting a little more intrusive. And then my mom finally booked me an appointment at a real deal, medical retinal research center at UCLA. And then, an actual retinal specialist said, yep, you've got retinitis pigmentosa. You'll maintain decent vision into middle age, and then it'll fall off a cliff. And so then I just carried that information around for, the next 20 years or so. And I'm 40. How old am I, Mike? I'm 42 years old. Right. Well, I'm a December baby. So I got
you got a couple months to go.
A 42-year-oldness in me. And at this point in my life, I had I read about all this in the book. But I have a feeling that like that part of his diagnosis way back when is coming true, and I feel like, okay, it's all finally happening and like it's happening more quickly. But then my current doctor is kind of careful to reassure me that that's not actually happening, and that RP, their understanding of it has evolved since then, and there's like a different genetic profiles, and that in fact maybe I might have some residual useful vision for many years to come. But one of the things that I really wrestled with both in the book and just in my life is the question of how much to cling to that sight and how useful that sight really is, and trying to figure out what what it means to be blind. If I'm blind, I'm certainly legally blind. I've got about 5 or 6 degrees of central vision. And I've left your question behind at this point, but
It's okay.
I wrote this book in some ways to answer that question of like where I fit into this world of blindness, and am I an outsider? Am I an insider? Like, at what point do I get to be part of the club? And all those really tricky questions that were really bothering me as a person, I got to kind of explore in the form of a book.
The interesting thing about what you said in the book, however, concerning are you an outsider or an insider, am I blind or am I not, is of course a question that everyone wrestles with. And I personally like the Jernigan definition. Have you ever read his article, A Definition of Blindness?
Oh, maybe. Tell me what he says.
So what he says is that you should consider yourself blind from a functional standpoint when your eyesight decreases to the point where you have to use alternatives to vision to be able to perform tasks. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use the residual vision that you have, but what you should do is learn blindness techniques and learn to psychologically accept that from a blindness standpoint or from a functional standpoint, you are blind, but you do also have eyesight, and there's no reason not to use that. But you still can consider yourself a blind person because you are using alternatives to eyesight in order to function and do things.
Yeah, no, I have heard that from the NFB. I didn't realize its source was Jernigan, but I really aspire to live my life that way. I think there are some days when it's easier than others. But I'm here learning, practicing Braille, using my white cane every day, like learning JAWS and trying to keep my screen reader on my phone as much as possible. Yeah. And it's funny how it becomes almost like a moral mind game that I play with myself, where I'm like, okay, like, wow, it's so much easier to use my phone with a screen reader. Like, why don't I just leave it on all the time? But then inevitably I get to like a inaccessible website, or like I'm trying to write a text message, and I'm like, oh, am I really going to like use the rotor to like go back up, to these words? And so then I turn it back off, and then I leave it off, and I'm just like constantly messing with my own head in this way. And I've heard from folks with RP who are more blind than I am, who have less vision. And there is the sense that like one relief of, even though it's, incontrovertibly inconvenient to have less vision, right? Like there's certain affordances that vision gives you that make life easier. But one thing that I've heard from these folks is that, that kind of constant obsessing and agonizing over like, how much vision do I have? How much vision am I going to have tomorrow? How am I going to do this with this much vision versus that much vision? Like when that goes away, it is a bit of a relief, I've heard.
Yeah. I mean, if it ultimately comes down to, you can obsess over it, you can stress about it. What can I do if I lose this extra vision or not? Is a question. But the other side of it is, why assume that just because you lose vision, you can't do X or Y? Right. Yes. And that's the thing that I think so many people tend to not really deal with. I believe that we have totally an inconsistent and wrong definition of disability anyway. I believe that everyone on the planet has a disability. And for most people, the disability is light dependence. And my way for making that is, look at what Thomas Edison did in 1878. He invented the electric light bulb, which allowed people to have light on demand so that they could function in the dark, because they couldn't really function in the dark until they had light on demand, or unless they had a burning stick or something that gave off light. But the reality is they still had a disability. And no matter how much today we offer light on demand, and light on demand is a fine thing, no problem with it, but recognize that still, without that light on demand, if a power failure happens or something and the lights go out, sighted people are at least in a world of hurt until they get another source for light on demand. I was invited to actually Kelly and Ryan's Oscar after party to be in the audience this year. So we went to the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel, which is fun. I used to go there for NFB of California conventions, a great hotel. And so we got there about 3:00 on Saturday afternoon, and it was my niece and nephew and I, and we were all there, and we just dropped our luggage off and we're going downstairs when suddenly I heard screaming, and I asked my niece what's going on. And she said, there's been a power failure in and around the hotel. I love to try to spread the rumor that it was all Jimmy Kimmel trying to get attention, but no one's bought that. But the point is that suddenly people didn't know what to do. And I said, doesn't seem like a problem to me. And it's all a matter of perspective, but we really have to get to this idea that it doesn't matter whether you can see or not. And you pointed out very well in your book that blindness is not nearly so much the issue psychologically as is our attitude about blindness.
Absolutely. Yeah. I remember I interviewed Mark Riccobono, the current president of the National Federation of the Blind, and he made a very similar point when we were talking about the nature of accommodations, which is something that I still am thinking a lot about. Is I think it's a very tricky idea and a very important idea, which I think your idea of light dependency gets at. And Riccobono's point was, look, we have our headquarters here in Baltimore, and we pay a pretty hefty electricity bill to keep the lights on every month. And that, the blind folks who work there, it's not for them, right? It's for all the sighted people who come and visit or work at the center. And in some ways, that's a reasonable accommodation that the NFB is making for the sighted people that they want to be inclusive of, right? And so, like, just even that idea of like what is a reasonable accommodation, I think you're right that we think of it as like the poor, unfortunate, disabled people who need to be brought back to some kind of norm that's at the center. And there's the kind of reframing that you're doing when you talk about light dependency, or that Riccobono is doing when he talks about, his electricity bill. It kind of puts the lie to that idea that the norm takes precedence. And the reality is that, that we all need accommodations, like you say. And so what's reasonable is really based on what humans deserve, which is to be included and to be, to have equal access.
And that ought to be the norm. Jacobus Tenbrook wrote a speech called The Pros and Cons of Preferential Treatment that was then pared down to a shorter article called A Preference for Equality. And I've been trying to find it. It's at the NFB Center, but it isn't as readily available as I would like to see it. And he talks about what equality is. And he said equality isn't that you do things exactly the same way. It is that you have access with whatever way you need to the same information. So you can't just say, okay, well, here's a printed textbook, blind person, that's equal under the law. It's not. He talks about the fact that we all really should be seeking equality and looking for what will give people an equal opportunity in the world. And that's really the issue that we so often just don't face like we should. The fact of the matter is, it's a part of the cost of business in general to provide electricity and lights. It's a part of the cost of business to provide for companies a coffee machine, although it's usually a touchscreen machine, but it's there. It's a cost of doing business to provide desks and computers with monitors and so on. But no one views providing a screen reader as part of the cost of business. And nobody views providing a refreshable braille display or other tools that might give me an equal opportunity to be a part of society. We don't view those as part of the cost of doing business, which we should, because that's what inclusion is really all about. We don't deal with the fact, or sometimes we do, that some people are a whole lot shorter than others. And so we provide ladders or step stools or whatever. But we don't provide cost of doing business concepts to a lot of the tools that say, I might need, or you might need.
Yeah. It's one thing that I've been thinking about lately is really even just the challenge of understanding what those accommodations are, because, I think practically speaking in the world, you'll call up a blind person and say, what do you need? Like if we're trying to make this art exhibit or this, business or this, HR software accessible, what do you need? And that one blind person might be like, well, I use NVDA, or that one blind person might be low vision, right? And they might be like, I use a screen magnifier. And it's so difficult to understand like what the accommodations are that would be adequate to cover like a reasonable sample. And so just like it's just so much more complicated than it originally seems. When you have a really well-meaning person saying like, we really value diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, but then like the distance between that well-meaning gesture and then actually pulling off something that's fully accessible to a wide swath of the whatever the users are is just it's just unfathomably huge. So that's something that I'm thinking about a lot lately, is like how do you approach that problem?
Well, and I think though at least as near as I can tell, and I think about it a lot as well, as I think any of us should, the fact is that one solution doesn't fit everyone. I'm sure that there are people, although I'm sure it's a minority, but there are people who don't like fluorescent lights as well as incandescent lights, and neither of them like other kinds of lightings compared to whatever.
Right.
And then you have people with epilepsy who can't deal as well with blinking lights or blinking elements on a web page. There isn't ever going to be, at least as near as I can tell, one size that truly fits all until we all become perfect in our bodies, and that's got a ways to go. So the reality is I don't think there is one solution that fits everyone. And I think that you pointed it out. The best thing to do is to keep an open mind and say, yeah, I want to hire a person who's qualified. And if that person is blind, I'll do it. And I will ask them what they need. And an example I could give you is, when was it? 3 years ago, I guess. 4 years ago now, actually. I was called by someone up in Canada who is a lawyer who went to work for a college, and we were talking about IRA, Artificial Intelligent Remote Assistance, AIRA. You know about IRA. You wrote about it. And she said, a lot of the discovery and a lot of the documentation that I need to use is not accessible through even OCR to be overly accurate, because there will be degradations in print and so on. So I can't rely on that. And certainly Adobe's OCR isn't necessarily going to deal with all the things that I need. So I'd like to use IRA. Is that a reasonable accommodation? And I said, sure it is. If that's what you need in order to be able to have access to the information, then it should be provided. Now, the laws are a little different up there, but nevertheless, she went to the college and made the case, and they gave her IRA so she could read on demand all day any document that she needed, and she was able to do her job. Not everyone necessarily needs to do that. And here, in probably some quarters, maybe there are other accommodations that people could use instead of using IRA, but still IRA opened up a vista for her and gave her access to being able to do a job. And I think that we really need to recognize that one solution doesn't fit everything. And the best way to address it is to ask somebody, what do you need in order to do your job? And we will provide it or work it out. And here in the US, of course, although they try to renege on it so much, but given the definition of what rehabilitation is supposed to do, they're supposed to be able to and help make people employable. They should be providing a lot of these tools. And sometimes getting counselors to do that is like pulling teeth. I'm sure you know about that.
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's interesting because I think in the face of that complexity of saying like, okay, we like interviewed a dozen blind people and we like have this, we know our website it's compatible with all the screen readers, and this event, like let's say you're doing an event and the website's compatible with every screen reader and it's got dynamic type so the low vision users are happy, and then the event starts and you're like, oh wait, we forgot about the existence of deaf blind people and there's no cart or captioners here. And and then the question for me, another thing I've been thinking about lately is like, how do you respond to that? Like what is the response? And even just like on a kind of like a social level, like, is it scathing indictment? Like you terrible people, you don't care about deafblind people, and so I hereby cancel you and I'm going to like tweet about how terrible you are? Or is there like a more benign approach, but then you don't get what you need. And and I think a lot of this is a function of my having grown up without a disability, really. I mean, like growing up, I went through my full education without ever having to ask for an accommodation. Maybe I had to sit a little closer to the board a little bit, but nothing like what I'm dealing with now. And I think as a result, I am just now starting to wrap my head around like how one self-advocates and what styles are most effective. And I think that's another really important piece of this conversation, because it's easy, I think, to walk into, Cafe X, or, I just did it last night, I saw this really cool looking new magazine about radio, which is an interest of mine, like for radio producers. And, it was print only, and I wrote like, hey, how can I get an accessible copy of this cool looking new magazine? And they're like, oh, actually we're putting our resources all in. We're kind of a shoestring operation. All our resources are going into the print edition right now, so then I had a question before me, right? Like, do I say like, hey, everybody, like, we must not rest until you agitate for these people to make their accessible thing? Or I just sort of wrote a friendly note, and I was like, there's a lot of like blind radio makers out there who might find your stuff interesting, and I like affectionately urge you to make this accessible. And then, their heart seems to be in the right place, and they seem to be working on making it happen. So I don't know, what's your thinking about that, of like how to respond to those situations?
So my belief is, whether we like it or not, every one of us needs to be a teacher. And the fact is, to deal with what you just said, let's take the radio magazine. Which magazine is it, by the way?
Oh, I didn't want to call them out by name.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just asking for my own curiosity, being very interested in radio myself. So we can talk about
let's
that
give
later.
them some good and bad press simultaneously. It's called Good Tape.
Okay.
It's brand new, and at the moment, it's, as of this recording, it's print only.
And tape is on the way out, but Good Tape, no, that's okay. Anyway, yeah. But no, the reason I asked was mainly out of curiosity. But look, you kind of answered the question. Their heart is in the right place, and it is probably true that they never thought of it. I don't know, but probably they didn't think of it. I've seen other magazines, like Diversity Magazine. Several years ago, I talked with them about the fact that their online version is totally inaccessible, and they have a print version, but none of it's accessible. And I haven't seen it change yet, even though we've talked about it. And so they can talk about diversity all they want, and they talk a lot about disabilities, but they don't deal with it. I think that it comes down to, what's the organization willing to do? I've dealt with a number of organizations that never thought about making a digital presence accessible, or having some sort of alternative way of people getting to the magazine. And I don't expect everybody to produce the magazine in Braille. And nowadays, you don't need to produce a Braille version, but you need to produce an accessible version. And if people are willing to work toward that, I don't think that we should grind them into the ground at all. If their heart's in the right place. And I can appreciate how this magazine started with print, which is natural. Yeah. But one of the things that you can do and others can do is to help them see maybe how easy it is to create a version that other people can use. For example, I don't know how they produce their magazine, but I will bet you virtually anything that it starts with some sort of an electronic copy. And if it does that, then they could certainly make that electronic copy a version that would be usable and accessible. Totally. And then they could still provide it through a subscription process. There's no reason to give it away if they're not giving it away to other people, but they could still make it available. And I also think something else, which is, as you point out in the book, in The Country of the Blind, so often things that are done for us will help other people as well. So great tape is wonderful, but how is a person with dyslexia going to be able to read it? So it isn't just blind people who could benefit from having a more accessible version of it. And probably it would be worth exploring, even discussing with them about finding places to get funding to help make that happen. But if somebody's got their heart in the right place, then I think by all means, we shouldn't blast them. We should be teachers and we should help them because they won't know how to do that stuff.
Yeah, no, I love that answer, to be a teacher. And I think there was a teacherly vibe in my response to them, like, this is a thing that is actually important and useful, and you ought to really seriously consider doing it. I mean, I think if you think about how people act in the classroom, it's those kinds of teachers who correct you, but they correct you in a way that makes you want to follow their correction instead of just ruining your day and making you feel like you're a terrible person.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because if you, I mean, a lot of this is the function of the internet. I see a lot of disabled people out there calling out people for doing things inaccessibly. And, I feel I'm really split about this because I really empathize with the frustration that one feels. Like, there's an amazing film, called I Didn't See You There, by a filmmaker named Reed Davenport, who's a wheelchair user. And the film is really just like he mounts a camera to his wheelchair, and a lot of it is like he almost like turns his wheelchair into a dolly. And there's these like wonderful like tracking shots of Oakland where he lived at the time. And there's this incredible scene where it's really just his daily life, like, and it's very similar to the experience of a blind person. Like, he'll just be on a street corner hanging out, and somebody's like, the light's green, like, what are you trying to do, man? And he's like, I'm just here waiting for my car, my ride, like, leave me alone. Yeah, you don't need to intervene. But there's this incredible scene where there are some workers in his building, or like in the sort of, it's sort of unclear, like they're working and there's an extension cord completely blocking the path, the accessible entrance to his apartment, and he can't get into his house. And he's just like the depth of his anger is so visceral in that moment. And he yells at them and they're like, oh, sorry, and they kind of don't care, but they're like, just give us a second. And he's like, I don't have a second. Like, I need to get into my house now, and he just has no patience for them. And it's understandable, right? Like, imagine that you're trying to get home, and as a matter of course, regularly every week, there's something that is preventing you. And then you see him when he finally gets back into his apartment, he's just like screaming in rage. And it's, so that rage, I think, is entirely earned, like, I don't think that one should have to mute one's rage and be a kindly teacher in that moment. Right. But so I kind of see it both ways. Like, there are moments for the rage, and then I guess there are moments for the more teacherly, because obviously, like, the stakes of me getting access to Good Tape magazine are very different than the stakes for Reed, like, getting into his apartment.
Right. Well, yes and no. It's still access, but the other part about it is, the next time that group of people and whatever they're doing to repair or whatever, if they do the same thing, then they clearly haven't learned. Whereas if they go, oh, we got to make sure we don't block an entrance, then they've learned a lesson. And so I can understand the rage. I felt it many times myself, and we all have, and it's understandable. But ultimately, hopefully, we can calm down. And depending on how much time there is to do it, go back out and say, look, do you see what the problem is here?
Yeah.
And please, anytime, don't block an entrance or raise it way up or do something because a person in a wheelchair can't get in. And that's a problem. So my wife always was in a wheelchair. And we were married 40 years. She passed last November. Just the body didn't keep up with the spirit, is what I tell people. And it's really true. But I remember we were at places like Disneyland, and people would just jump over her footrests. How rude, and other things like that. But we faced a lot of it, and we faced it from the double whammy of one person being in a wheelchair and one person being blind. And one day we went to a restaurant. And we walked in and we were standing at the counter, and the hostess behind the counter was just staring at us. And finally, Karen said to me, well, the hostess is here. I don't think she knows who to talk to, because I'm not making necessarily eye contact, and Karen is down below and in a wheelchair. And so finally I said, maybe if she would just ask us if we would like to sit down, it would be okay. And it was friendly, and it broke the ice, and then it went from there. But unfortunately, we bring up children and we bring up people not recognizing the whole concept of inclusion.
Yeah.
And we really don't teach people how to have the conversation. And I think that that's the real big issue. We don't get drawn into the conversation, which is why diversity is a problem, because it doesn't include disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that seems to be changing. I mean, you have, you have a lot more experience in this realm than I do, but haven't you felt like a real cultural shift over the last, 20, 30 years about disability being more front of mind in that conversation?
I think it's shifted some. The unemployment rate among employable blind people, though, for example, hasn't changed a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of things regarding blindness haven't really changed a lot.
Yeah.
And we still have to fight for things like the National Federation of the Blind finally took the American Bar Association all the way to the Supreme Court because they wouldn't allow people to use their technology to take the LSAT.
Yeah.
Lawyers of all people. And, so things like that. There's so many ways that it continues to happen. And I realize we're a low incidence disability, but still, I think the best way to really equate it, you mentioned Dan Goldstein in the book.
Yeah.
Dan, who I think is a great lawyer, spoke to the NFB in 2008. And one of the things he talked about was Henry Mayer's book, All on Fire. And it's about William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist. And he was looking for allies. And he heard about these two ladies, the Grimm K sisters, who were women suffragettes. And he said, look, we should get them involved. And people said, no, they're dealing with women's things. We're dealing with abolition. It's two different things. And Garrison said, no, it's all the same thing. And we've got to get people to recognize that it really is all the same thing. You mentioned Fred Schroeder and the American Association of Persons with Disabilities at various points in the book. And in 1997, Fred, when he was RSA commissioner, went to speak to the AAPD, talking about the fact that we should be mandating Braille be taught in schools to all blind and low vision kids. And the way he tells me the story, they said, well, that's a blindness issue. That's not our issue because most of those people weren't blind. And that's unfortunate because the reality is it's all the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's something. Dan Goldstein was a really important person for me to meet very early on in the process of writing the book because, just because he's brilliant and has such a long history of arguing in a very, legalistic, which is to say, very precise and methodical way. A lot of these questions about what constitutes a reasonable accommodation, and as in like the lawsuits that he's brought on behalf of the NFB have really broken ground and been incredibly important. So he was a wonderful resource for me. One of the things that he and I talked about, I remember at the beginning, and then I had lunch with him earlier this week. We still are talking about it, and it's exactly that question of the thing that really dogged me as I pursued writing this book, and one of the kind of questions that hung over it was this question of identity, and like the sense that like the NFB argues that blindness is not what defines you, and yet there it is in their name, the National Federation of the Blind, right? And like where does this identity fit? And I think that when you talk about other identities like the African American civil rights movement, or you mentioned the suffragette movement, the feminist movement, and it's interesting to compare these other identity-based civil rights movements and the organized blind movement and the disability rights movement, and think about the parallels, but then there's also, I think, disconnects as well. And so that was one of the things that I was really, really challenging for me to write about. But I think it's a really important question, and one that's really evolving right now. One of the things that I discovered was that, in addition to the sort of blind or disability rights movement that's very much modeled on this civil rights model of like, the first time I went to an NFB convention in 2018, the banquet speech that Mark Riccobono gave was all about the role of women in the Federation, which someone told me afterwards, like, this is all new territory for the NFB. Like, there hasn't traditionally been this sort of emphasis on including other identities, and I found that interesting. But then also I was so struck by a line in that speech where Riccobono said, the fact that they were women is not as important as the fact that they were blind people fighting for, whatever it was, like the liberation of blindness. And, so there's still always this emphasis on blindness as like the most important organizing characteristic of somebody as a part of that movement. And it makes total sense, right? It's the National Federation of the Blind, and they're fighting that 70% unemployment rate. And I think by their lights, you don't get there by, taking your eyes off the prize in some ways. And so I was really struck by some of these other groups that I encountered, particularly in 2020, when a lot of the sort of identity questions came to the fore with the murder of George Floyd.
Right.
And then I was attending, because it was 2020, it was the convention was online, and I read, this is all in the book. I went to the LGBTQ meetup, and which is also like a shockingly recent development at the NFB. There's this notorious story where President Maurer, ostentatiously tears up a card at an NFB convention where there are LGBT NFBers trying to organize and have an LGBTQ meetup, and he sort of ostentatiously tears it up as soon as he reads what's on the card. A lot of still raw pain among NFBers who I talked to about that incident. Anyway, like this LGBTQ meetup, there's a speaker who's not part of the NFB named Justice Shorter, who works in DC. She's blind, and she's part of what is called the disability justice movement, which is very much about decentering whiteness from the disability rights struggle and centering Black, queer, people of color who are also disabled. Right. And in some ways I found the NFB struggling to connect with that model. I talked to Neil Lewis, who's the highest ranking Black member of the NFB. Right. And he wrote this really fascinating Braille Monitor article in the wake of George Floyd's death, where he's sort of really explicitly trying to reconcile like Black Lives Matter movement with live the life you want, with the NFB slogans. And it's a tough thing to do. He has a tough job in trying to do that because of the thing, that I'm saying about Riccobono, right? It's like, right. Is blindness the most important characteristic, or where do these other qualities fit? So it's a very contemporary argument. And it's one that I think the organized blind movement is still very actively wrestling with.
I think it's a real tough thing. I think that blindness shouldn't be what defines me, but it's part of what defines me. And it should be that way. It is one of the characteristics that I happen to have, which is why I prefer that we start recognizing that disability doesn't mean lack of ability. Disability is a characteristic that manifests itself in different ways to people. And in our case, blindness is part of that. For women, being a woman is part of it. For men, being a man is part of it. For being short or tall or Black or whatever, those are all part of what defines us. I do think that the National Federation of the Blind was an organization that evolved because, as I said earlier, we're not being included in the conversation. And I think that for the Federation, blindness is the most important thing and ought to be the most important thing. And I think that we need to be very careful as an organization about that, because if we get too bogged down in every other kind of characteristic that defines people and move away too much from dealing with blindness, we will weaken what the message and the goals of the National Federation of the Blind are. But we do need to recognize that blindness isn't the only game in town, like eyesight isn't the only game in town. But for us, blindness is the main game in town because it's what we deal with as an organization.
Well, how do you reconcile that with the idea that you were talking about before with the argument that, like, with the historical example of, it's the same fight, the suffragettes and Like, because this isn't that kind of contradicting that idea that like having the intersection of identities, you know, and these movements all being linked by some kind of grander systemic oppression, you know, so it is relevant.
Well, it is. Yeah. And I'm not saying in any way that it's not relevant. What I am saying, though, is in the case of the Grimm K sisters, he wanted their support and the support of other people, Garrison did, in terms of dealing with abolition, which was appropriate. Their main focus was women's suffrage, but it doesn't mean that they can't be involved in and recognize that we all are facing discrimination and that we can't start shaping more of our messages to be more inclusive. And that's the thing that I don't think is happening nearly as much as it ought to. The fact is that it doesn't mean that blind people shouldn't be concerned about or dealing with LGBTQ or color or gender or whatever.
Yeah.
But our main common binding characteristic is that we're all blind.
Right.
And so for us as an organization, that should be what we mostly focus on. It also doesn't mean that we shouldn't be aware of and advocate for and fight for other things as well. But as an organization, collectively, the goal really needs to be dealing with blindness, because if you dilute it too much, then you're not dealing with blindness. And the problem with blindness is being a low incidence disability. That's all too easy to make happen.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting just thinking about that question of dilution versus strengthening, you know, because I think if you ask somebody in the disability justice movement, the dilution happens precisely with an overemphasis on a single disability, right? And then you lose these like broader coalitions that you can build to, you know, I think it comes down to maybe like the way that you are analyzing the structures of oppression, right? Like, what is it that's creating that 70% unemployment? Is it something specifically about blindness, or is it like a broader ableist structure that is connected to a broader racist structure, you know, that's connected to a broader misogynist structure, you know? And I think if you start thinking in those structural terms, then like coalition building makes a lot more sense, because it's like, I mean, I don't know what kind of political affiliation or what political orientation to take with this, you know, but certainly the disability justice movement is pretty radically to the left, right?
Yeah.
And I think traditionally the NFB, for instance, has had a lot more socially conservative members and leaders. And so it's, you know, that reconciliation feels almost impossibly vast to think of like an organization like the NFB taking the kind of like abolitionist stance that a lot of these disability justice groups take, to say like, actually capitalism's the problem, right? So I mean, the thought experiment only goes so far of like imagining what like a disability justice oriented NFB would look like. But, you know, I think there are young members, you know, and I do think it's a generational thing too. Like, I think there are NFBers in their 20s and 30s who are really wrestling with those questions right now. And I'm really interested to see what they come up with.
I think that the biggest value that the NFB brings overall, and I've actually heard this from some ACB people as well, is that the NFB has a consistent philosophy about what blindness is and what blindness isn't. And that is probably the most important thing that the NFB needs to ensure that it doesn't lose. But I think that the whole, and the NFB used to be totally against coalition building. That goes back to Jernigan and Maurer, although Maurer started to change some of that. And I think it will evolve. But, you know, the NFB and blind people in general have another issue that you sort of brought up in the book. You talked about people who are deaf and hard of hearing, that they form into communities and that they have a culture. And we don't see nearly as much of that in the blindness world. And so as a result, we still have blind people or sighted people referring to us and it not ever being called out as blind or visually impaired. But you don't find in the deaf community that people are talking about deaf or hearing impaired. You're liable to be shot. It's deaf or hard of hearing. And
Yeah.
the reality is it ought to be blind or low vision, because
Yes.
visually impaired is ridiculous on several levels. Visually, we're not different, and impaired, that's a horrible thing to say. But as a group, and I was going to use community, but I guess the community isn't as well formed to deal with it yet. We're not there, and so all too often we talk about or hear about visually impaired or visual impairment. And that continues to promote the problem that we're trying to eliminate.
Yeah. That question of blind community is fascinating. And I do think that, I mean, from my writing the book, I certainly have found blind community, but if I really think about it, if I'm really being honest, I think it's more that I've met, it's my work on the book has given me access to really cool blind people that I have gotten to become friends with. That feels different than like, welcome to this club where we all meet, on Tuesdays and have our cool, like, blind, paragliding meetups. Not that people aren't doing that. Like, then there are really, I would like to get more. If I lived in a more urban center, I'm sure I would be involved in, like, the blind running club or whatever, where I would hang out with blind people more regularly. But it doesn't feel like a big community in that way. And it's interesting to think about why. I think one big reason is that it's not familial in the same way. Andrew Solomon wrote a really interesting book called Far from the Tree that gets at this, where, like, when a child has a different identity than a parent, like, deaf children of hearing adults, there isn't a culture that builds up around that, and it's really like these big deaf families that you have with inherited forms of deafness, or, and then schools for the deaf that, and with deaf culture in particular, really what we're talking about is language, and sign language creates a whole rich culture around it. Whereas with hearing blind people, they're more isolated. They're not necessarily automatically, you have to really work to find the other blind people, with travel being difficult. It's a lot easier to just, like, get to the public library to meet up in the first place, and so on. So yeah, it feels a lot more fractured. And so I think you do see groups more like the NFB or the ACB who are organizing around political action rather than, like a culture of folks hanging out, going to a movie with open audio description. Although I will say that the weeks that I spent at the Colorado Center for the Blind, which is, you could think of it as like it's a training center, but in some ways it's like an intentional blind community too, right? Where you're like, it's like a blind commune or something. I mean, that is just a beautiful experience that it's not for everyone in terms of their training method, but if it is for you, like, wow, like, for just such a powerful experience to be in a community, because that is a real community, and nothing will radically change your sense of what it means to be blind and what it means to be in a blind community than living for a while at a place like that. It was a really transformative experience for me.
Do you think that, especially as the younger generations are evolving and coming up, that we may see more of a development of a community in the blindness world, or do you think that the other forces are just going to keep that from happening?
Well, one of the things that I discovered in writing the book was that, and this is sort of contradicting what I just said, because there is a blind community. And, I write in the book, like, at first I thought that blind techies were another subculture of blindness, like blind birders or blind skateboarders.
Right.
But then, the more I looked into it, the more I realized that, like, being a techie is actually like a kind of a basic feature of being a blind person in the world. And I don't care if it's 2023 or 1823, because if you think about the problem of blindness, which is access to information by and large, you basically have to become a self-styled information technologist, to get what you need, whether it's the newspaper or textbooks or road signs or whatever else. So I do think that, like, when my dad was living in the Bay Area in the 90s, and I would go visit him, he was a sighted techie, and, he would always be part of, like, the Berkeley Macintosh user group, which would just be like these nerds emailing each other, or, I don't even know if email was around. It was like late 80s, but people who had, like, the Mac 512Ks, and they would they would connect with each other about like, well, how did you deal with this problem? And like, what kind of serial port, blah, blah, blah. And that's a community, right? I mean, those people hang out, they get beers together. And if there's anything like a blind community, it's the blind techie community, and I like to tell the story about Jonathan Mosen. I'm sure you've encountered him in your travels.
I know Jonathan.
Yeah. So when I discovered his podcast, which is now called Living Blindfully.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, oh, okay, here are the conversations I've been looking for, because he will very regularly cover the kind of like social identity questions that I'm interested in. Like, is Braille, like, is the only way for a blind person to have true literacy through Braille, or is using a screen reader literacy, or like, is there such a thing as blind pride? And if so, what is it? And I was like, these are the kinds of questions I was asking. And so I was so delighted to find it. But then in order to get to those conversations, you have to sit through like 20 minutes of like, one password on Windows 11 stopped working when I upgraded from Windows 10 to Windows 11. And so like, what, what JAWS command can I use to, and I was like, why is there like 20 minutes of JAWS chat in between these like really interesting philosophical conversations? And eventually I realized like, oh, because that's like what this community needs and what it's interested in. And so in some ways, like the real blind community is like the user group, which I think is actually a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Well, it is definitely a part of it. And we do have to be information technologists in a lot of ways. Have you met, and do you know Curtis Chong?
I've met him very briefly at an NFB convention.
So Curtis and I have known each other, since the 1970s. And we both are very deeply involved in a lot of things with technology. He worked in various aspects of assistive technology, worked at the NFB Center for a while and things like that. But he always talks about how blind people, and I've heard this at other presentations around the NFB, where blind people, as Curtis would put it, have to muddle through and figure out websites. And the fact is, we do it because there are so many that are inaccessible. I joined Accessibility 2.5 years ago, and there are a lot of people that don't like the artificial intelligence process that Accessibility uses. It works, however, and people don't really look far enough. We're not, I think, being as visionary as we ought to be. We're not doing what we did with Ray Kurzweil. And look, when the Kurzweil project started with the NFB, Jernigan had to be dragged kicking and screaming into it. But Ray was so emphatic, and Jim Gashel at the Washington office finally convinced Ken Jernigan to let him go see Ray's machine. But the rules were that it didn't matter what Ray would put on the machine to read it. It had to read what Gashel brought up. Well, he did, and the relationship began, and it's been going ever since. And I worked running the project in the sense on a day-to-day basis. I traveled. I lived out of hotels and suitcases for 18 months as we put machines all over, and then I went to work for Ray. And then I ended up having to go into sales, selling not the reading machine, but the data entry machine. But I kept to consistently see the vision that Ray was bringing. And I think he helped drag, in some ways, the NFB as an organization more into technology than it was willing to do before.
Interesting. Yeah, I heard a similar comment. The one thing I got wrong in the first edition of the book that I'm correcting for subsequent reprints, but I really bungled the description of the Opticon. And my friend Robert Engelbretson, who's a linguist at Rice University, who collects Opticons. I think he has got probably like a dozen of them in his house. He helped me, because I didn't have a chance to use one. Right. He helped me get a better version of it. But he also sent me a quote. I think it was from Jernigan, a similar thing where, like, I think they were trying to get the Opticon included with, Voc Rehab, so that students could, not Voc Rehab, but whatever, like, so that students could get, blind students could use them. And it was the same thing of like, this newfangled gizmo is not going to help, but Braille is what kids need. So I do that. That's all to say that makes sense to me, that resistance to technology, and it's like it's a sort of conservative stance of like, we understand that what blind people need is Braille and access to, equal access, and don't try to give us anything else. And, and I think, to be fair, like, even though the Opticon sounded like an incredibly useful tool, as is, of course, the Kurzweil reading machine and everything that followed from it, there is, I talked to Josh Mealy for the book,
Mm-hmm.
who now works at Amazon. And he had this great story about his mentor, Bill Gary, who would basically get a phone call like once a week from a very well meaning, like retired sighted engineer who would say like, oh, you know what the blind need? It's like the laser cane, right? Or it's like basically like a sippy cup for blind people, like so that they don't spill juice all over themselves. And, and Gary would very patiently be like, actually, I don't think that would be helpful. And you should probably, talk to a blind person first, maybe before you spend any more time trying to invent something that blind people don't need. So I think that resistance to like newfangled technology, there's a good reason for it.
Well, there is, but let's take the Opticon. Look, I think the fastest I ever heard of anybody reading with an Opticon was like 70 or 80 words a minute. And there are only a few people who did that.
Yeah.
Candy Linville, the daughter of the engineer who invented it, could, and Sue Melrose, who was someone I knew, was able to, and a few people were. But what the Opticon did do, even if it was slow, was it still gave you access to information that you otherwise didn't get access to. And I had an Opticon for a while. And the point was you could learn to read and learn printed letters and learn to read them. It wasn't fast, but you could still do it.
Yeah.
And so it did help, but it wasn't going to be the panacea, I think, that telesensory systems wanted it to be. And then you talked about Harvey Lauer, who also developed and was involved in developing the stereotoner, which was the audio, in a sense, the audio version of the Opticon, where everything was represented audio-wise. And I spent a lot of time with Harvey at Heinz a long time ago. But the fact is, I think the question is valid, is listening and so on, literacy like Braille. And I think there is a difference. It is. Are you illiterate if you can't read Braille? You point out the issues about grammar, the issues about spelling, and so on. And I think that there is a valid reason for people learning Braille. At the Colorado Center, they would tell you, for senior blind people, you may not learn much Braille, but you can learn enough to be able to take notes and things like that, or put labels on your soup cans and so on. So it's going to be different for different people. But we are in a society where Braille has been so de-emphasized, and that's the fault of the educational system for not urging and insisting that more people be able to use Braille. And that's something that we do have to deal with. So I think there is a literacy problem when people don't learn Braille. But I also think that, again, there are a lot of things that Braille would be good for, but using audio makes it go faster. It doesn't mean you shouldn't learn Braille, though.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting, and it's a related idea, this sense that technology, this like just sort of wave your hands and say the word technology as a sort of panacea, where I think, it's a tragic story where people will say, oh, well, little Johnny has, some vision, so like he could just use technology, like he doesn't need Braille. And it's fascinating to me because I never really felt it. And maybe it's because I encountered Braille at a point in my development as a blind person that I really was hungry for it. But, people talk about Braille the way they talk about the white cane. Like the white cane, I felt so much shame about using in public. And it's just so stigmatized. Whereas Braille, I just always thought was kind of cool. But, you hear it so much from parents where it's just like their heart breaks seeing their child reading with their fingers, which is, and so as a result, they're like, why don't I just buy like a gigantic magnifier that maybe in 5 years you're not going to be able to use anyway, but like at least you're reading the same type of book that I read.
For a half hour or 45 minutes until you start getting headaches.
Exactly.
And,
exactly.
I worked on a proposal once. I was an evaluator for it. We were in a school in Chicago, and one of the teachers talked about Sally, who could see, and Johnny, who was totally blind. Literally, it was Sally and Johnny. And she said, Sally gets to read print. Johnny has to read Braille. Sally couldn't read print very fast. Her eyesight wasn't good, but she got to read print, and Johnny had to read Braille. And it's the kind of thing that we see all the time. And it's so unfortunate. So, I do understand a lot of the technology resistance. But again, people like Ray helped us vision a little differently. But unfortunately, getting that conversation to other people outside of the NFB community, like teachers and so on, is so hard because so many people are looking at it from a sighted point of view and not recognizing it as it should be. The NFB did a video. They did several. They've had a whole series of things regarding Braille, but they've interviewed a number of people who had some residual vision who were never allowed to learn to read Braille. And invariably, these people say how horrible it was that they didn't get to learn to read Braille. They learned it later, and they're reading slower than they really should, but they see the value of it. And it's important that we hopefully work to change some of those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it gets back to earlier in our conversation about those norms, and then the sort of privilege that society puts on the center, on the norm, on, you know, and the damage that gets done when the ability of Sally to read print is overemphasized to her detriment. Yeah. And it's an interesting, you know, there's a really well-known, at least within the world of, like, you know, people who study this stuff, a story about, you know, the first school for the blind in the US, which is now called Perkins, right? You know, where its founder, Samuel Gridley Howe, visited, you know, the school for blind youth in Paris, the first school for the blind in the world. And, you know, where Louis Braille was a student and where the Braille system was developed. And, you know, he saw it flourishing, you know, in the UK and in Germany, and came back to the States and said, well, but actually, like, that's this like strange code. And like, wouldn't it be better if we stuck with the original raised print systems where, you know, it's very much the same impulse of like Sally using her magnifier, right? It's like, I can look at that page of raised print, even though the blind people are saying actually, like, it's infinitely more difficult to read a page of fine print than it is to read a page of Braille. But like, there's this universal design aspect to it. There's a really interesting exhibition that you can find online called Touch This Page that where I first encountered a lot of this history. But as a result, you know, and also there's sort of a financial aspect to it, you know, like Howe poured a lot of his own money and the money that he raised into promoting Boston Line Type, the raised letter system that he developed. And as a result, you know, Braille was like 40 years late to come to the US compared to its flourishing in Europe. And it's the same, it's this sort of misguided universal design. And it was something that I was thinking about in DC, where I met you, you know, where we were having this conversation about mainstream classrooms with blind students in them. You know, we were the meeting that we were at was talking about STEM education for blind kids, but like in the context of a mainstream classroom. And it seems like there's these two paths, right? Like there were these really fun conversations about, oh, like we could have like a Braille ready file and they can download and print it on an embosser or get a thermoform machine and like make this like wild 3D thing that the blind student can have, like, you know, and then just thinking about the logistics of that, of like what embattled, overworked, you know, mainstream fourth grade teacher in Bowling Green, Ohio is going to like have access to a thermoform machine, is going to like be able to figure out how to like get the BRF file, you know, versus just like, what if you made a curriculum that had tactile affordances, that like was screen reader friendly, so all you needed was an iPad to access it for a blind kid, you know? And so the universal design thing is real, but there is a way that it can kind of, you know, there's like a dark side to it too, where it can swing in the other direction. Well,
the other thing is, if you have things in electronic format, there are organizations like Bookshare that also will do Braille on demand, which is helpful. And Bookshare has made it possible to have access to a lot of material that otherwise wasn't available in a readable, like a Braille readable form. But now they're also doing more with producing audio stuff, but that's okay. But I think that it is important that the Braille still be there, and that we do need to teach blind kids Braille. And I'm using Jernigan's definition of blind, because the fact of the matter is people need to understand the rules around spelling and grammar and writing. I mean, you wouldn't be the writer that you are if you didn't learn a lot of things. Yeah, if I hadn't spent a lifetime reading. I mean, that's what it really comes down to. That's right. But you done good with the book. And, you know, we're going to have to stop because this has been going on. But can we pick this up and do this again and do another one?
Yeah, sure. That'd be
I
great.
think we should. But if people want to reach out to you, how do they do that? And how do they get the Country of the Blind?
My email address is on my website, which is andrewleland.org. And my last name is spelled Leland. So it's andrewleland.org. And you can find my email address there, as well as links to recent stuff I've been publishing and links to the book. The book is, if you are a blind reader, it's on Bard. It's on Bookshare. And also just, shout out to Bookshare. I could not have written this book without Bookshare. The number, of books that I didn't have to scan. I eventually bought a scanner for stuff that it wasn't accessible, but like, wow, that just bless Bookshare forever. But yeah, it's on Bard and Bookshare. It's also, as you mentioned, I think I narrate the audiobook myself, and it's on Audible, Libro FM, or wherever fine audiobooks are downloaded. And also, of course, on the Kindle store, or you can buy a large print edition or a good old fashioned dead tree version, all that, support your local indie bookseller. It's on Amazon, but also I really recommend, if you're buying a print version, a website called bookshop.org. That's sort of like an indie Amazon alternative where you can, it's just as easy to buy a couple clicks, but then it supports, you put in where you live and it supports your local indie bookseller.
Your local
so I
stores.
really like that.
Yeah, that is cool. Well, and of course, if I were going to do a commercial, I'd tell people, please go out and continue to buy Thunderdog. It's out there, and and it's a lot of fun. But I want to thank you for being here. We will do this again, and we'll set it up, because this is just stimulating, interesting, and it just, I hope, helps people recognize the value of having the conversation. So this was really a lot of fun to do.
Oh, it's an honor to talk to you. I just the number of stories you have and the history that you've lived through with this stuff that I've been immersing myself in the last 3 years. It's really fun. I mentioned somebody and you're like, oh yeah, I remember like the first iteration of that 40 years before you even thought it, it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, I want to thank you for listening out there. We really appreciate you doing it. Please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to Unstoppable Mindset. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can do it by emailing me at Michael, MICHAELHI, at Accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com, or go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson, HINGSON for Hingson.com/podcast. So please give us a 5-star rating. Love to hear your thoughts and your reviews. Feel free to email and keep us posted with your thoughts and your ideas. And I promise Andrew and I are going to do another one of these in the very near future. But for now, Andrew, I want to thank you once again for being here with us.
All right. Thank you. Super fun.